What is up, everyone? Hello, and welcome to this episode of the TSMU Q&A series. I'm your host this evening, Christian Homie Lee. Just a little info for those of you guys who haven't seen me before. A little intro is that I'm the global sales manager for TSM. I work with brands, making deals, and being the first introduction brands really have into TSM. I also help come up with fun activations to help TSM in esports and really just be a TSM fanboy in every essence. Today, we're joined by an extremely special guest, the absolutely incredibly talented Rose Leung. How are you doing, Rose?
Good. I'm very excited to be here and I'm very excited to be a part of this. I'm very honored that I was asked.
Yeah, we only ask the true heroes at TSM, and Rose is definitely one of them. Seriously, if you guys have not seen any of her work, I highly recommend it. I'm sure there's a plug somewhere, bottom left, up where find her on Twitter. You'll find some really cool stuff. We have a really exciting show for you, and we're excited to get to it. But quick reminder and overview for those of you who haven't seen the show. For this Q&A, we'll be pulling questions from the TSMU Discord. So if you have a question for Rose, head to discord.gg/TSMU and ask your questions in the Ask Stream Questions Here channel. Once you've asked your question, if it's a call-in question, join the waiting room voice channel to wait to be selected to join us on the show. While people get their question in, Rose, why don't you tell us a little about yourself and what you do as a role as a graphic designer for TSM?
For sure, for sure. So, my name is Rose, very obviously graphic designer for TSM. I handle all the very cool stuff that you look at on Twitter sometimes. I work in tandem with Monique and also Patrice, who are also my coworkers and also the best people alive. Let's see, what was the other question? What was I supposed to talk about? I'm very much forgetting again.
All good. Just a little bit about what you do and just who you are. Just any
Mhm.
background helps.
Ooh, okay. So I can go about this all day. I will try to be brief.
Let's do it.
Um, I started out in, I would say, 2018 being a volunteer and brand ambassador for San Francisco Shock, which basically just means I was the one handing out the free goodie bags at events. And I was the one tabling at Smash events where Smashers really don't care about Overwatch. So, very humble beginnings. Um, I eventually started working in graphic design when one of the people at San Francisco Shock had like something on the side and they're like, hey, we need a designer. What can you do for us? And I was like, a lot. So I started working as a designer a little bit here and there. I didn't take it too seriously. And then I started freelancing. I would probably say maybe 2019, 2018. And that was the early days. That was the very early days where like I would charge $15 for a Twitter header. So we
Wow.
progress, progress. Um, I worked here and there with like tier 3, tier 2 Overwatch teams. I was very involved in the Overwatch side of things. That's basically where I was like born and raised, if you would say. I spent a lot of time kind of going back and forth between freelancing and working between orgs until I landed the position at T1 as their first graphic design intern. Um, that was really fun. I spent a lot of time at T1 kind of cultivating my skills. I had really great people around me. And then I kind of learned how to be more professional in that sense. After working at T1, I feel like all my experience beforehand is like nothing compared
Hmm.
to all the stuff that I had done at T1. After at T1, that was an internship that actually got extended because I was just so good at my job. No, I'm kidding. I really liked working there and the people really liked me. I moved to G4TV, which is also another I guess child company under Comcast Spectacor. T1 and G4TV were owned by the same thing. If you guys don't know, G4TV is essentially a American not news television, television network that specialized in like very early gaming culture. Like I would probably say like early 2000s. Would that be right? Early 2010s. They had stuff like American Ninja Warrior, X-Play, Attack of the Show. Um, all my family and all my like my siblings and stuff like that, they remember like G4TV, but
Hmm.
um, I just kind of grew up remembering, oh, Ninja Warrior is on. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
I
yeah. The
worked
American
there
Ninja
for
Warriors, is that?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That's that's how I remember it. So that happened. I was very very excited to be a part of that, and now here I am at TSM.
yeah, that's awesome. Everyone, I think Rose's story is super interesting and super unique because I think in my eyes it's the definition of hustle, right? And I think, if you guys seen me before, you kind of understand like I'm always about like getting your name out there, finding your niche and just really getting well known in the industry. And Rose is definitely a definition of, I won't say bottom because I think you've obviously always been incredibly talented, but kind of like, start at the bottom, now we're here. Um, yes, you can cringe from me in the chat, whatever it is. I'm just my reference is her hustle is awesome and truly unique and something you could definitely learn from. Um, yeah, so let's jump off to the questions. We have a question from EH2O who asks, what were some main things you did to continue mastering your skills in programs, for example, Adobe Illustrator, Photoshop, etc. So I think this really definitely lines up in terms of, you know what I mean, like the interesting mechanics you need to get into design and how important that is and how you learn to master your craft is who you are, Rose.
For sure. I would probably say my first exposure to Photoshop was wow, when I was like 12, and this is showing my age. I'm only 22, but I feel very ancient. My dad gave me Photoshop on a CD, on a little CD. You know when they used to sell the physical versions, and you would have
Yeah,
to
let's
link it in
go.
your computer. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And I used to post like Photoshop like tutorials on like my YouTube, and that was really a really embarrassing time. I learned the basics from my dad, and he was just like, "Oh, this is just something to keep like my kid busy." The older I got, and then when I turned like probably like 18, 19, when I started doing stuff for in actual graphic design, I spent a lot of time self-teaching. A lot of it was like I already came from an art background. I used to paint, I used to do a bunch of other stuff. So I had like a pretty solid idea of what things should look
Hmm.
like, what looks good, and I'm very meticulous about details, which I think a lot of people need to be if you're a designer, right? Um,
Hmm.
for skills like Illustrator, there are just some things that I would like shotgun. I remember I talked about this a little bit in like a very, very old interview, but I used to not know how to use Illustrator a couple years ago, and then I landed this gig at Killsteel where I'd be designing apparel, and I was like, oh, like I'm not too familiar with Illustrator, but like I can definitely that's just something that I can get into.
Hmm.
I really just sat down for 24 hours straight, and this is when I was still in college, so like that's a totally acceptable thing to do.
Yeah.
Don't do it if you have like a job and like responsibilities. I sat there for 24 hours straight and I learned Illustrator top, bottom, like just clicking around stuff, watching YouTube tutorials, and I had the whole thing down in about 24 hours, maybe a little over because I had to go to a dentist appointment between all that. I'm very all or nothing, and I think a lot of my efforts as a creative are aren't very consistent. I would probably say I kind of work ethic as a creative is very sporadic, very on and off, very like it comes to me,
Hmm.
sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes I have to work for a lot of things. Which is why
Yeah.
I think it's good to be transparent about the creative process as mastering skills or designing anything in general, any kind of creativity. If it's your job, it's not always going to be a constant flow of really good ideas. You're going to have moments where you suck, and
Yeah.
that's kind of okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Would you say it's almost like a step-by-step process? So I mean, I guess bringing it back to like the whole, which tools you should, start with or program. Like for example, I used to be in film and I used a lot of editing. I started actually my career with Avid Media Explorer, which is more film editing and all that stuff. But I think from there I realized, oh wow, there's other tools that do different things. And I kind of stepped on based off of my initial interest, kind of similar to what you started with Photoshop you really grow on that by like, oh, I need another tool to work on this. Let's like it's almost like mastering this quote unquote champion if you're a league or whatever game insert game here, but
Mhm,
building on top of that, right? Like realizing there's more opportunity and more skills to master from another skill. And you kind of built off of that.
mhm. Yep. It was essentially just building off of their skills I already had, making
Yeah,
sure I had time to adequately learn the new things I was taking on. So much of it is essentially just, do you want to do it or not? And
nice.
I've spent most of my life working under that principle where if you want to do it, then you'll do it. If you don't want to do it, then you'll keep pushing it back until you forget about it. I
Yeah,
lose track of things very easily. I'm very easily distracted. I'm very much moving around all the time. So for me to kind of sit down and I would say decide on a career was not something that I did because I'm inherently a decisive person. I'm very much not. I spent my first 2 years of college as a computer science major. Look where I am now. I graduated in business, by the way. So that just kind of shows, the progress of, oh, I want to do all these things at the same time, but sometimes when you have to become an adult and lock down the career that you want to do, it's very much you have to choose and you have to choose quick before you start wasting your time and wasting thousands of dollars at an institution.
yeah, no, I like that. I mean, I think it's well, there's a little bit of two part of it where you're exploring, especially if you're an institution, you're exploring your opportunities, your interests, and then you really kind of build at that and take yourself seriously and say what you're good at and what you want to do full time. It's
Mhm.
a really cool note. We've got another question from Kelly P, who asks, "You've interned at T1 and are now working at TSM. Are there any changes in the work environment between South Korea and US companies?" That's a really good question.
That is a
Um,
really good question.
yeah, I
I've
think
never
that's
heard that
interesting.
asked before.
Yeah.
So I can very much say that it's very, very different. I think to be fully transparent, I had to be very particular about the way I did things at T1, not just during my work, but during my personal life too. There's a
Mhm.
lot of stuff going around when I was working at T1, and I learned the very, very hard way that it is best to not detach yourself from your work. I'm not saying people that work in esports shouldn't be passionate, but I do think there is some honesty in you shouldn't be married to your work, especially when you work for such a public organization. And whether you like it or not, I guess for someone who's in my position, I kind of just ended up the I don't want to say public face, but I do want to say public facing in that
Mhm.
regard. I was very much in the light more than I thought I would be. I, I originally thought, oh, if I'm an intern, people won't really pay attention to me. Like I'm just the intern that does stuff. That's not true. Um, there are people that go through my tweets and go through everything I've ever tweeted and go through my likes and whatever. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't have anything to hide, but I do think it's very weird that people are perceiving me, and I learned that the hard way. And now it has only increased, but I think it's just something that I had to come to terms with. Working with a work environment that's very much kind of like an Asian work environment. I didn't experience that too much because T1, when I was there, we had a split group. So there was a Korean side of management and then there was like the American side of
Mhm.
management. And we were relatively separate. I don't think it was anything that was super it wasn't cross-functional, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And I think that a lot of it was we worked very separately, but once in a while I would hop in and help with some stuff, and sometimes they would hop in and help with stuff on my end. Some stuff you just can't not collaborate on, so like branding, headers, stuff like that. When it came to that, we were very much locked in. Otherwise, I didn't see much of other Korean staff, and they never saw much of me. I would probably say, if anything, I think I'm very much more accustomed to like American staffing. I'm
Mhm.
very much used to also just the mm, I don't want to say I'm not public facing still because I don't work at T1 anymore, but I do want to say that there's a lot less pressure on me. But I think that's just because T1 is such an inherently prestigious organization. Not that TSM isn't, but T1 just has like Faker and they have like these fans that are like very much overseas and very much rooted in Korea, which, is really cool for them. And I think that's awesome in so many ways. But I had to learn that, I have to be more careful about how I do things and I need to be more thorough about how I assess certain things.
No, absolutely. That's actually really interesting, and I feel like it's one unique to your really cool background here, but two interesting. There's an interesting aspect of esports where obviously fandom and entertainment is really popular and really impressive, especially from the sports side of things. And I would imagine, T1 and maybe even like the esports scene over in Korea can get pretty intense at times. And I would say, I mean, you're correct me if I'm wrong here, Rose, or if you think otherwise, but I feel like there's almost like a it's almost a difference not only in culture, but I guess esports fandom with T1 and TSM, which is not something you would typically take into factory if you're applying to a normal job, right? But there's almost that extra element of esports fanaticism that can certainly be, I guess, add an extra layer to it and be kind of unique. And whether you like that or not is obviously personal preference and up to you. But I'm sure there's stories that kind of break that down.
It's a lot.
Kelly, yeah, we were chatting about it earlier, group, and it's very interesting. I think there's a crazy dynamic. I won't say crazy, but I would say T1 seems like there's a lot of different things that you're gonna have to deal with from an internal perspective, external perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Kelly also asked, have you ever created merchandise product for an esports team? If yes, what is your approach to merchandising design compared to normal digital graphics? Really,
Ooh.
not another really good question. I don't think from a basic level. I mean, Kelly, if you're a graphic designer, it kind of seems like you kind of get that perspective. But I'm sure certainly think this is something that non-graphic designers might not even understand that there's a huge different process that goes with different creative aspects of products and stuff.
Yeah, so when I worked on esports merch, I generally didn't work on jerseys. Jerseys are my forte. it's just not something that was very much asked of me in my creative career. It's something I can do, just not something I prefer doing. I mostly spent a lot of time working in, I want to say, I spent a lot of time working in casual apparel. I think that's where I kind of just naturally went towards whenever I was designing. I didn't do anything for T1 because we at the time were in a partnership. I think they already had their Nike release. So I had no hands on that. My very cool boss, Ryan, who's at G4 TV now, handles all that really, really cool apparel stuff, jersey stuff. When I was at G4, I helped with some stuff. So I helped with the casual clothing merchandise. Very simple stuff, very casual things, just kind of your baseline, I want to say, like logo on a t-shirt type deal. I did some other more fun designs that I don't know if they've been released yet, so I can't particularly talk about it to a very big extent, but I did work on a lot of stuff like in terms of product and merchandising when I was kind of going around. I would probably say most of it was when I was at Kill Steel, if anything. So I handled some stuff for Evil Geniuses, which is really cool. I did some apparel for them, which was like all my original designs, really really fun stuff. And then G4 TV, which is kind of just the more say I don't want to say corporate, but we had to keep things on a very strict brand guideline. I think there's a
Hmm.
lot of creative freedom when you're working with something that has so many stakes involved in such a big company, and that's just how it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I actually a really interesting perspective too from the sales and sometimes when we talk to brands, more likely apparel brands, even from the presentation or pitch prospect to get the deal done, we want creative mock-ups and we want some cool stuff. So as we talk to apparel brands, we'll talk
Go along
to
with it.
designers.
So approaching merchandising design is essentially just you have to imagine it a person wearing it. Would you wear it? Are your tastes what the general public has the same taste of? And you have to be very mindful of color usage. You have to be very mindful of how you design things, how you format things, the color you choose, um, color matching. I would probably say a lot of back and forth because just instead of doing normal design where it's all digital for social graphics or for stream assets or stuff like that, you're always dealing with, oh, whatever I make in Photoshop or whatever I make in Illustrator will be directly translated to whatever I put out because all you need to do is save it as a PNG or save it as a JPEG or whatever, and you're set. That's not the case for merchandising design. When you make apparel, when you make anything at all, you have to go through, everything needs to be in vector format. You need to know your Pantones. You need to know exactly what the manufacturer wants because each manufacturer wants something different, which is very, very, very headachy at times. Different manufacturers have different needs. Different manufacturers also have different requirements and constraints. So you're always not just working for yourself, you're working as a team of people. And that's the hardest part about it, in my opinion.
That's actually super interesting. I've always been interested in that process because I feel like when I ask for something, it's literally like, oh hey, like I need this. I don't know what it is. It's just a custom
Mhm.
jacket. Have fun on it. I imagine there's just layers of things that you guys need to work on and come up with and think of. And I think from my end, I always hate giving the instructions of like I honestly have no idea where to start. Have fun with it, but I'm sure context helps with like everything. So I think as you kind of, it sounds like you kind of have a whole outline process, get it what it's done, deal with salespeople like me and my BS, and try to figure out what the end goal is here, and come up with something really unique that you always do.
Yeah, I honestly don't think you have ever put in any crazy requests that would make me scratch my
Oh,
head. I feel like everyone's been
thank
really
you.
good about that. But I have dealt with in the past where I would work directly with manufacturers and they would be super vague about what they want, or they wouldn't specify what they want until way later. And there's also just some really weird restrictions you have to put up with at times. So when I was at G4 TV, I think when I did the merchandise for them, they mentioned something that, oh, we can't do print on the arms because of the manufacturer that we're going for. And I was like,
Yeah,
man, you
yeah.
know, it was kind of just like a moment of, oh, okay, like I can't do what I want. We have to be very practical here. So anything that involves merchandising design, anything that involves print, you have to be very practical. You have to be making sure that not that you're looking at design differently too, but you're approaching your designs differently. Your work ethic has to be a little bit altered because you have to consider how many people are going to be looking at this because it's a physical
Mhm.
product. There's going to be a lot more eyes on it than usual. There may be too many chefs in the kitchen at times. how you want this formatted. What are your limitations, not just from the manufacturer, but from your boss, from the people around you, from the people that are approving this? And it's a lot more constrictive. And I think that's why when merchandise does well, it's so gratifying because it's
Hmm.
in spite of all of these roadblocks you had to get through to get this one thing produced. And
Yeah.
not only that, but it's assuring the quality afterwards. I've had so many experiences where not just I've experienced, but other people have experienced as well, and like other colleagues that I have, they will be very excited to, create their own products. They'll be very excited to make their own merchandise. And some teams or some other, independent manufacturers, they just don't make good things that translate well over. So I think I remember one company I was working for, this was wow, a long time ago. We had this issue where I sent over the right colors. I sent on the correct colors and everything that we needed. Like, hey, here's our brand guidelines too, with you know the colors in every single format imaginable. So you guys cannot mess this up. And then by the time we got the shirts, it was like this is not even remotely the same color, and it's more like a stock color instead. So
Oh.
it's stuff like that you always have to keep an eye on because it's like you're translating something on a digital screen to something that's physical in your hands, and creating a product is always meticulous and always super tiring because for designers, if you're working on anything that's, digital, I want to say digital, you have full control about how the end result looks. If you don't
Hmm.
like something about a stream graphic, if you don't like something about a graphic in general, you can change it. You can fix that, and that's kind of your responsibility. When it comes to a product that goes through multiple people and you're not the one directly making these things, there's a lot more factors in the air that kind of go up and down, and you're not really sure what you're going to get. Some things will happen where it's not going to go your way and it's really going to suck.
Yeah, so that's actually really interesting, and I was kind of curious on, I guess, the brand relationship side as someone super creative as yourself. Do you have like, let's say, here's the instructions, this is what you need to do, maybe it's a jacket, whatever, and then you come up with this awesome like brainstorm in your head. You're like, oh, I'm going to do this, 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 this. Do you often come into like creative restrictions or roadblocks that's just like, dang, like, what I mean? Obviously, you as a professional have probably found really nice outlets to find solutions to come out with what you want, because I think you said something really important to you. The best stuff is stuff that you really love yourself and have been able to put 150% effort to it. Do you often come into like restrictions where you feel like you can't really fully ideate what you want, or maybe it's even like from the end result it just doesn't, what I mean, it doesn't turn out the way you thought it in your head?
My God, all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. And that's not just restricted to, I guess, creative blocks myself. Sometimes it can just be outright, there are just certain things you cannot do. And that really
Yeah.
sucks. And you're kind of dealing with a bunch of restrictions. So I've had so many experiences where I would be micromanaged or people wouldn't
Mm.
necessarily trust my intuition with designs. There's so many times I can talk about this, and I won't
Hmm.
be super specific, of course, but there's just been so many times where any kind of like restrictions that are put down because they think this looks good, but I don't think it looks good necessarily. Any kind of micromanaging in that regard, or I want to say, I don't want to say restrictions kind of jut down on creativity because I don't think that's necessarily always true. I think you can still be very creative despite restrictions, but I do think there is something that's very disheartening as a creative when people micromanage you and people kind of
Hmm.
don't have faith in what you're proposing, or you're trying to persuade them with something and the end result, because of all these revisions and too many cooks in the kitchen, you're
Hmm.
not happy with the end result, but you're the one that made it and you're making it not for you and not because it looks nice anymore, but you're making it because someone else said to
Hmm.
make it this
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, from the sales end, I've always wanted to send a player to the moon. We couldn't quite do that. We don't have the SpaceX connections, but said we made the FTX deal, and here we are. But
way.
that's awesome. Really cool note. We have a question from Avenue who asks, considering you've worked for a lot of different organizations over time, Armada, Noble, T1, G4, IRC, and now TSM, how did you find those opportunities and how did you go about applying for them? So mainly about, going to like, how do you get a job in esports and how did you kind of hustle your way here and do the grind? Because again, like I said in the beginning of the show, you have an awesome background of just like just doing it, right? The whole Nike model is the point that you made.
Mhm. I would probably say, oh, that is a really good question too, and I get asked this all the time, but I never know
Mhm.
exactly how to answer it. It's ooh, I want to say from the very beginning with Armada, I believe I had been posting my work online for the longest time. I was applying for jobs, but in my experience, me applying for jobs was always very hit or miss. I think the state of what esports generally is you send in an application and there's a 50 chance you get an interview and then get ghosted, and then maybe the 25% where you get
Yeah.
hired, or the other 50% where you just don't get anything at all. Esports
Yeah.
has this very big culture of just ghosting people and not really saying much otherwise. So
Unfortunately.
it's very easy for people to be discouraged when you're applying to all these things, you're not getting responses at all. Not surprising in this field, and unfortunately, it's just a norm, even though the nicer thing would be like, hey, you didn't land this position, or we're just not interested at the moment. That doesn't happen in esports. I essentially, if I'm remembering correctly, I have essentially brute forced a lot of the positions that I've had.
Let's
And
go.
I think it's whether through directly asking people that I had already known and just getting to know a lot of people. Usually, the protocol whenever I would get hired at a place, like when I was at T1, I made sure to introduce myself to everyone. I made sure that everyone knew my name, they knew what my position was, what I was capable
Yep.
of doing, what I wasn't capable of
Yep.
doing. And it was just like this roundabout, like you always have to be talking to people. And that was a really stressful time because whenever I was working at Armada and when I was working at Noble, there's a lot of factors going on. Not so great factors here and there when it came to like the kind of nitty gritty, like balancing school life, balancing working, being like a waitress or being a librarian. I think I was a librarian for most of my time when
Oh,
I
wow.
was starting out in esports. I was a library assistant. I worked at San Francisco State's
Wow,
library,
that's really
and
cool.
I essentially rented out laptops to people, and I would kind of make my money on the side doing that. And then after that, I'd get off, after going to school, going to work, and then I'd go to work for Armada, and I'd do stuff for Noble. And this is all while I was in school. That when I landed that position at Armada, I think is because I had consistently been posting up posters of like the really I want to say the trend in 2018 was like the smoke graphics and the gritty paper textures and all that really cool like heavy GFX stuff. That's what I was doing back in the day when that was very popular. Same thing with Noble. Noble, I cleaned up my design a little bit, and I think Noble I was brought on because one of my peers, Aria, essentially took me on and they were like, "Hey, we're looking for a designer. I've seen your work in the past. I know you in the past because I just had always been talking to people and always have been introducing myself to people." So that kind of just happened in itself. I was at Noble for a little bit, and then T1, I got in essentially because I want to say I want to say that at that point I had built up a good enough resume where I was
Mhm.
constantly posting about my work. My branding at the time was not very personal as it is now. Now I kind of just fulfilled the goal that I intended to do with social media, and it's more for me now than anything else. But back in the day, like my social media was purely just for graphic design, occasionally posting about things I like, but I was also a freelancer, so I had to be very conscious of what I posted. The only reason I ever made a Twitter account to begin with when I was finally like working in esports was because I needed some way to get exposure, and I lived in San Francisco. I'm not in LA.
Mhm.
I'm not in Texas. I'm not going to get those opportunities by just showing up to events anymore. At best, I was very lucky that Overwatch League had a San Francisco team,
Mhm.
and if it wasn't for that, I would not be where I am. So geographic issues, I was kind of like I didn't have the best advantage in that regard. I utilized what I could, knowing that esports is so online and everyone can reach each other in that way. I was like, I'm just gonna go that route where it's like my entire online presence is design, my entire online presence is, wanting to work in esports and, occasionally the one-off post about being like a freelancer or doing other stuff. But it was a lot of just marketing yourself. And I think when you work as a creative in esports or just wanting to have any position in esports, if you aren't qualified, super qualified from the jump, you have to spend so much time not only being your own manager, but being your own social media manager, being,
Mhm.
just kind of like your own life coach in a bunch of ways where you really have to stretch yourself thin, I think. And I stretched
Mhm.
myself really, really too thin for that. And this was like in 2018, 2019. So we didn't have the resources people had before where it was like, oh, I can sign up for discords where collegiate esports people meet together.
Mhm, mhm.
Doing all this other stuff, like everything that I have done in esports has essentially been brute forced. um I don't know if I should say this. I'm gonna say it anyways. I have always brute forced everything, including when I used to be VP of the SF State Gaming Gators Esports Club. That also was illegally run. SF State, don't look at this.
Building
I
T, guys, you heard it here first. Exclusive, TSMU
I
exclusive.
took I took over the club because it was dead at San Francisco State from somebody else, and this is just like this. I'm digressing a little bit, but I'm telling the story because it's a
No, it
testament to
helps.
my work ethic.
Yeah,
Um, they handed over the paperwork too late to transfer ownership of the team of the club. So me and my friends were like, we can't have an official club because we missed the deadline because the older
mm,
officers didn't give that to us, and now we have no idea what to do. So we were just like, we'll just run it illegally. We'll show up to events as the Gamigators. We'll just say we're from SF State, but not officially put it on anything on any of our socials. Uh, so I ran it illegally for a year.
well,
If
hey,
they will not
sometimes
let
it's
me,
a regret.
I will make
Yeah,
it work.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's kind of just how my mindset has been with everything.
yeah,
Um, I gave up a lot for it, to be fair, and I really
yeah.
wish that I had the really cool resources that people have now, where it's like you have so many support groups, you have so much you have so many things that you can get involved in to give back to the community and give to the community, and also just kind of earn back from it, if that makes sense. And it's so weird to think about because we're only in like 2022, right? Like 2018, 2019 was only like a couple years ago. And yet the scene was so drastically different back then, from the
Mhm.
approach to how people got jobs back then to just what support systems there were for people that were trying to kind of get a leg up on being a creative in esports.
Yeah,
I
absolutely, yeah.
I essentially was just extremely motivated by the fact that nobody was going to help me and that I didn't have anything, but I'm very happy people have it now because I think that nobody should suffer in the same way that I did, which was like working three different jobs to
Mhm.
make sure that I could do what I wanted to and kind of burn yourself out the way I did. I
Yeah,
don't think it's
no.
the optimal kind of route anymore. I think we're way past that. Um, and I just think that we're better than that at this point. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really valid point. You said you're showing your age at 22. Showing my age you're more at 26. So I definitely resonate, and I'm sure there's people older in the crowd that go, "You kids are ridiculous."
Mhm.
But that's exactly it. I think as the years go on, you make a really good point about using our resources, right? So I
Mhm.
100% believe in that, and you joining communities like this, making sure your name is out there. Once you get the job, you brought up a really good point in terms of once you get the job, that's the very, very beginning, right?
Yeah.
It's all like, unfortunately, you do have to be a little extroverted. I say unfortunately for those who are a little introverted, but it is a little bit extroverted to kind of always have to talk to people, have to network to get that out there. But networking really is everything, especially when you're at the job. I know I'm currently blessed as being the definition of an extrovert, but I will say having conversations with everyone and trying to meet people as much as possible, one builds awesome relationships, that builds awesome collaboration, but gives you the next opportunity, right? And I'm sure that's kind of how you made your way up the ladder and who you know. You
Mhm.
also brought another really good point I'd love to highlight, where it's, if you're 1 for 100, who cares? All you really need is that one. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
I think TSM, you've heard me say that a bunch if you've seen the previous episodes. But it's all about just applying, because what's the difference between 99 no's and just like one no? The difference is at least you tried 99 times and then you just need the 100. If you only try
Mhm.
one, you're still 99 away, right?
Yep.
But yeah, no, Rose, definitely love that mindset, and it's a really good hustle aspect to it. And I can tell you, you're still doing it, and you're gonna make it far in the next couple of years with with that headset mindset.
Uh, the momentum is so difficult to uphold when it comes to esports. I
Yeah,
think there's a lot of commitment that comes into not just working in esports, but continuously growing in esports. And this just applies for general jobs. This doesn't just apply to esports in general,
yeah,
at least.
absolutely.
Right? It would apply like overarching, but specifically in esports, from my experience, there's a lot of self-reassurance that you need to have. I think when it comes to kind of being a creative in esports with mm, such a rocky route. because esports is very Wild West still, in my opinion.
Mhm.
You have to come to terms with, you have to be creative, and the work that you put out has to be good all the time when you're starting out, right? You
Yep,
know,
it's a hustle,
once
yep.
once you make it, and this is just in general, for anyone in esports, once you reach that level and you keep that momentum going, it's a lot easier. I would
Mhm,
probably say my life now is a lot easier compared to when I was just first starting out. It's still very difficult in its own new fun ways, but
mhm.
that first starting out, getting your foot in the door is, it's really cheesy to say, but it's like one of the worst things ever because you have to be constantly putting out work. You have to be overworking yourself sometimes, it feels like. And you really shouldn't. In a perfect world, you really shouldn't. But in my experience, I really had to push myself and force that creativity out. And I think that sense of desperation to put good work, it worked in some ways or another. I look at it now and I think all my work is bad because it's like so dated.
Mhm.
But it's
Yeah,
it's really all about, sometimes you have to know, mm, you have to know when to force it, and sometimes you have to know when to step back. And I think that's really unhealthy, and I wish it was a better way to do it. Like in a perfect world, my advice would be, oh, like take the time you need, foster your creativity, do what you want. Um, and then the realistic advice is, yeah, you really have to work your ass off if you want something. And I
yeah.
talked about this a little bit in my panel with I was in this panel last week that was talking about like women in gaming, but especially like as a woman that works in esports, it's very, the face I'm making says it alone, but it's
No, I
it's
get that.
very like,
It's a grind,
you
yeah.
know,
Yeah,
it's you're very much jumping back and forth and you're constantly proving yourself.
yeah,
Not a challenge that I would necessarily turn away from because I like challenges, but it's something to keep in mind. It's very competitive
yeah,
already as is, and then you're also dealing with a bunch of other factors when you're doing that
yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's talk about that balance a little bit because Avenue asked, how did you balance work for the organizations with personal creative work projects? Because you talked a lot about kind of that split, and it's hard, right? Especially if you feel like you're constantly having to prove yourself and constantly grind. Where does that balance lie, and how do you do that?
I really want to say that I'm very fortunate now as someone who works a great job at TSM. I do not have to stress myself out super
Hmm.
frequently about keeping up personal projects. One of the quirks of working in esports and kind of being established for this while is you get the chance to slow down, and it's not that your work isn't good anymore, but the work that you put out is a lot more focused and concentrated, especially when you work professionally. I feel like when I worked at probably Armada or Noble when I was still in college, it was very, very difficult to balance work for organizations while also keeping up personal projects. I was working freelance to kind of just give myself a groundwork to be like, hey, I can still make things that's not related to this company's branding, or I can make something that's a little bit different and a little bit out there so I could still stretch my creative muscles without getting too rusty. That in itself was very, I don't even want to say it was like rewarding. I mean, it was, but the forefront of it was that I was always stressed out. I
Hmm.
was working a physical job and like being a waitress, being a librarian at the same time while I was doing all these things. So when I was at I think when I was at Armada, waitress, library assistant, freelancer, graphic designer for Noble, full-time student for university. That really sucked. That sucked
Hmm.
so bad. And I don't think anyone should go through the same thing that I did. I did it because I really liked taking a challenge and I wanted to see what I could do. I made it work, but at a
Yeah,
very crazy
absolutely.
cost. And it's Mm. I think that's a really good question, but the truthful answer is I still don't know that answer myself, and I'm still
Hmm.
working to get things out the way I can. What I can say is that once you kind of get a little more comfortable in your design and you want to branch out from new stuff, it's never bad to try new things, and it's never bad to make things about things you like. If you're an esports designer, but you don't necessarily want to do something related to esports for a project, don't feel like you have to stick to that. I think
Hmm.
people, especially like hiring management at jobs, they really really appreciate a variety of projects that show consistency.
Hmm.
Um, if you're working for a position, that's towards an organization specifically, stream packages and Twitter headers are not going to help you. What's
Hmm.
going to help you is flesh out projects that may be completely different from each other. You may have an esports brand next to a case study or a UI UX project, but if you show consistency in those projects, it just shows you can do more stuff. It just shows that, you have hats that you can wear. Um, if you want to do all these things and get employed at a company, you have to understand that they don't want to see the cool stuff that you can do. They want to see the cool stuff you can do while maintaining consistent branding. How
Wow,
good are
that's
you at
great.
figuring out
Yeah.
brand archetypes? How good are you at surveying what the fans like about this brand or company when you do a rebrand? What's the fan sentiment? What is the company sentiment? What is the company values? What does the company want to look like? You have to put all these things into account. And when you're doing rebrands as a personal project, you get to have a little bit more liberty with it because you're much more flexible in determining what this brand is. You have to consider your audience and you also have to consider a bunch of other things. But for the most part, when you do a rebrand for a personal portfolio piece, for example, you get to do things that you wouldn't usually get to do in a real rebrand. I think real rebrands are very rewarding and very cool because the feedback process is awesome. But if you get to do something no bars held, it's such a fun experience. And I think it's such a great way to stretch creative muscles. I think it's
Mhm.
such an important thing to have, especially when you do creative work projects. Do something you care about, not just something that you think other people want. Because if you're doing things because other people want it, it's not going to look good. I don't
Yeah.
care how much you force it, it's not going to look good.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I guess honing in onto that kind of not looking good or even stress element of things from your note. Marcus actually asked, when you reach a block creatively, what's your go-to things to do to recharge and refresh yourself? So I think that's an interesting narrative because you definitely, like you said, you definitely want to pump off creative things that look good and resemble everything that represents the brand, all your other notes. What happens if you just can't? You know what I mean? Like you hit a wall. Is there anything that you do in particular?
Oh, this is a very good question, and it's gonna involve me digressing and talking about video games.
Let's do it.
So,
We're a gaming channel here. Esports.
I I will say this now for anyone that was hoping that I am some diehard FPS player or some diehard League of Legends player. I regret to inform you that as principal, because I already focus on those games so much for work, I do not play them often
I
because
actually
I
really
need to
get
keep
that.
my sanity intact. Um, but I do enjoy single player games. I've I've always been a very single player or MMORPG type person. I'm very, very good at multiplayer games that are like, oh, Final Fantasy 14. And I don't think that's a surprise necessarily because I was a Club Penguin kid and I was a Roblox
Oh,
kid.
let's go. I was a
Um
Neopets kid.
Dude, I don't think I was old enough for Neopets, which is like the really messed up part. That's
Yeah,
also showing how young I am at the same time.
and that's
Um,
showing how old I am. 26. I have the little dial internet modem dial.
Oh my god. I wanted to do the Neopets thing so bad. I don't think I ever figured out how to work that site because I was so young. But I was very much like I grew up like because I grew up with like my brother who was like a gamer, but he,
Yeah,
like when you're an 8-year-old, what are the options you have for kids to play video games? Like this guy's not gonna let me play like League or whatever.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
he let me play like The Sims. Like I played a lot of like first person games.
Sims.
I played
Yeah.
a lot of like, when I got older, like online games, so like Club Penguin, Roblox. I almost failed the sixth grade because of Roblox. And we had to strike a deal with my sixth grade teacher where they're like, if you go to Kumon for a couple months, I will
Oh
pass you
God,
over to sixth
Kumon.
grade. And I was like, I'll take that.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I've always been very not good at FPS games. But I
yeah.
will say I did have a very bad TF2 itch when I was like
Tier
12,
two. Let's go. Yeah,
15.
yeah,
So I think I think I also don't play FPS games because they make me a very bad person.
yeah.
I The anger issues I have on me go crazy as soon as I open up an FPS game. Like it
Chair
was
goes
already bad.
flying. Yeah.
It does, and I can't. It's just not something that. Oh, my camera just disconnected for
Oh,
whatever reason. Hold up, let me pull that up
technical
again.
issues. Yeah, that's funny. No,
Ugh,
you're good. Well, as we try to hope to see if that pulls up, my anecdote is that's funny that you say that because
I think I
I
closed it
almost
by
failed.
accident.
I almost failed the sixth grade for Maple Story. So similar note, might be old. I don't know if that's an old or too old for you thing, but
Okay, I think we should be good. We should be good.
I think you're good. You're good. We're in the
You think
clear.
we're in the clear? Okay, cool. Cool. So, um, I wish I knew how I was also too young for Maple Story, which is really funny. Um, I literally was like, I think I downloaded MapleStory and I turned my display upside down. So I like freaked
Oh
out
no.
and then I just never opened it
Yeah.
again. But a lot of people I know were MapleStory kids. I really
Yeah.
liked watching the MapleStory music videos on YouTube.
Oh, let's go.
Because
Dre 86. I got this Tiger, the Famelet. Oh, man, these are names that you probably aren't. But for all you Maplers out there, this is a call out to you. Let's go. Maple Global circa 2000, what, six?
oh, oh my God. Okay. But yeah, whenever like I have creative blocks, it's literally just like I play my favorite video games. Right now I'm very big on Final Fantasy. You can see Aerith from Final Fantasy 7. I have her figure like
Nice.
right above my
There's the
head.
call out.
There she goes.
I give her a goal to point that out during call, and there it is. It naturally flowed too. Credit.
Mhm.
That's bonus points. We
She's
have
right
guest
above my
fee
head.
points, and that's a whose line. What is that thing? Whose line is it? Anyways, that's 1,000 points for accomplishing that mission.
Mm,
um,
perfect.
yeah. So games is definitely a nice relaxer.
Games and also on occasion doing like really small personal projects, not something I commit to make a portfolio piece necessarily, but just making like small one-off pieces that I feel really good about, or just having a chance to have like a no holds bars,
Yeah.
no bars held kind of situation, just so I can
Awesome.
have the flexibility to have a little more fun and stuff.
Yeah. Let's hone in on that portfolio piece element to it. Because Katarp actually asked, when creating a portfolio to showcase your creative work, what are some things that you think should be focused on and others to avoid doing standing out from doing it to stand out from the crowd? So kind of exactly your choice, like what pieces do you actually use for your portfolio? What would be considered
Ooh,
one that would be good to leverage?
I can talk about this all day because I've been working on my website. So creating portfolios is very much show your work. Straight
Yeah.
up, show your work. I don't care if it's process shots. I don't care if it's anything else. Like, oh, here's like a couple drafts when I was first starting out. If you want to talk all day about your creative process, go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
Or if you feel the need to just copy paste everything that you did into a document and, leave that up to whoever's looking at it to have their own interpretations, that's also a great thing to do. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think people should be more flexible about portfolios. I think as long as you show your work in a creative manner, that's all that matters, right?
Yeah.
Something that I think people should be more focused on, I think, though, is making sure that their cover images are really appealing. I have not seen a lot of people make very appealing cover images. They'll just
Mhm.
make like, oh, like for Behance projects, for example, I just see like the logo on a white background, and I'm like, I don't know what this project is gonna look like, but okay. I think people put too much emphasis on like the outer cover of portfolios that they
Mm.
kind of forget that you're supposed to be showing off your stuff creatively. I would usually recommend the easier method, which is just putting one of your favorite works as the kind of profile picture of the project. I think that people should do that more often. And I think some stuff that people should avoid more often. Ooh, I could go on for this all day. I think people that I'm still learning this as I go along,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
something that I have noticed and I think people really should avoid is forcing yourself into this idea of, oh, I need my portfolio to be like this exact certain way
Mm.
to convey this like
Definitely.
creative idea. There's a lot of people that I know that are super successful and they don't have their own website. They just use Behance. And I'm like, listen, what works for you works for you. How you want to display your work is your choice, and it's always your choice. It's always good to have like certain things that you take from other people that you can make into your own. But if you're just looking at someone's like Behance or like portfolio style and you're like, oh, that's looks really pretty, I'm going to directly apply it to my work. I think that happens a little too often, and you can tell because the format is a little uncomfortable. I'm still learning that as I go along because there are sometimes I will just follow the trend of what I've usually done for other portfolio pieces, and then I'll be, oh, this doesn't really seem to fit the agenda of what I want to show off on this portfolio. It doesn't achieve what I want it to, and I think that there could be more done to show off what I want to show off instead of just showing off what I think I should show off. And it's kind of just this thing of people not showing enough their work enough, where they're thinking, oh, I just I don't want to make it too like long or drawn out. I think it's much better if people see a lot of your work, not to the point where you post every single piece, of course, but enough where you're able to hone in and be like, yeah, this this is a work that I really like, and here's some other pieces that I've done. And it's big enough where it's a lengthy thing that someone can look through and get a feel for how consistent you are, or how much variety you can do within constraints, or when you work with other people. What people are really looking for when you're doing stuff like this is how well do you work with not just other people, but I guess with someone looking over you if you're working a junior position or an intern position, and what are you capable of doing in spite of all that? Because personal projects are really cool when you're starting out. When you become a more established designer, you kind of run into people more so looking towards what was your take on this direction of
Hmm.
something? What was the company, did this align with the company? And you can tell by what the outcome is, right? I can very much understand how some designers feel like, oh, I feel like I really didn't like this project enough, like I don't think I'm going to show it off on my portfolio. I think people should anyways, because even if you're working under crazy constraints or you were really burnt out during that time, I think it's worth keeping up, at least for employers to see, hey, this was something that I took on despite this and that and like this certain issue. And I think it's also something that can be turned around and made into something more. I want to say it's a show of. mm, I want to say you can turn it around into showing off how resilient you are and how
Hmm.
your design can work with other people, even if it doesn't exactly go your way. You can also, in certain interviews, if they're being asked questions about your portfolio, which you will be, of course, but you'll be able to talk more about like, oh, we had this issue when I was at this place. Not that you're trash talking the company necessarily, but just you faced a lot of constraints and restrictions, and this is how you made the work that you put out now despite that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you can't really force it. And I feel like, especially if you're expected from a business angle to be able to
Mhm.
explain your methodology, your your process, your thought process, if you force it, it's just not going to be natural and it's just not going to lead to creative. And plus, you can't even explain your work. So that makes a lot of
100%.
sense. What about kind of an angle of almost like, I think there's almost this, I won't say upper echelon, but there's like, hey, look, you made it, you obviously know kind of what it takes to kind of get to where you are, and the shining star that you are over at TSM. But Absol underscore ow asked, what kind of intangibles have you noticed that a lot of the successful people in esports have that people who haven't made it don't have? So it's kind of like that, what's that, I don't know if there's one particular thing, it doesn't sound like there ever is, that like every successful person has this. But if you were to kind of take a look at like, certain maybe skills or attributes that people like in your caliber of graphic design have, what are some, what might that be?
Ooh, specifically for designers, I would probably say when it comes to design, I've been in certain positions where I have overlooked hiring processes. This is not so much now, but when I was looking for someone to take over when I was at different companies,
For sure.
we had a lot of talks about not just portfolio. Portfolio is very important, but it's something that you can show. Like that's something that's like tangible in a sense. When it
Yeah.
comes to looking for someone that I think I can put my bets on to be really successful, it's always people that have this certain mindset and attitude about them that, well, how do I want to describe this? I don't want to say super ambitious, because people that are super ambitious can still fail and still make mistakes
Yeah, sure.
greatly. But I do think there has been this trend in where I will meet people who do exceptionally well in esports, and they're all people that have this common denominator where they understand inherently as a creative that you're going to have moments where you feel like you're not putting out the work that you think your caliber is at, and they
Sure.
learn to not be super put down by their creative blocks, but to work with it.
Yeah.
um I don't think there's an easy way for people to get over creative block. I think it's something that you have to really wait out and kind of heal from your own time. It's not like, oh, if I feel really burnt out, like I'm just gonna like speed run the entirety of Final Fantasy 15 and then like I'll be good. I'll be good for the next day. Something that burnout really does to you is that it burns you out and it takes a
Yeah.
while to build that back up. It's not just like, oh, a couple days off will fix that. It's I need to consistently just at for one, stop trying to fight burnout in a direct and really aggressive way, which is very much in contrast to my personality where I am constantly brute forcing things. This is one of the things that I have learned through experience. You can't brute force and you have to be very
Hmm.
careful about. I had essentially learned to live with creative block, but find small ways to test myself every once in a while to get a feel of where I was at. So, if I was feeling a little bit better, I would take on like, oh, like let's make like a one-off graphic or like let's try something new. You have to be very good at understanding you have creative block, but still being resilient past that. You still have to understand that you you can't force it. You have to learn how to work with it and make that a part of your work ethic.
Yeah,
Just
it's
because that's just the nature of what creatives do?
yeah, it's like seeing and some you look for people who can handle adversity, right, and
Yeah.
kind of push through, but also like understand what they're, how they could handle it. If there's a hiccup, totally understandable. It's how you push through. So that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. I think from my end, it's always, for personally when I'm interviewing someone, I always look for, you know, like someone who really just wants to own something. Like, you could be the best damn pencil picker upper ever, but like if you kind of show that, you show your passion and you just show that this is, you're the right person for this job because you're the best at X or Y. I always think that's kind of resilient and almost like that extra layer of an intangible. It's almost that like, mixture of you can see the go-getterness to it, but also someone who could be able to pick up multiple hats and just kind of take off one and own it and say, this is what you're missing. Let me run it. Um,
Yeah.
that's great. We have one more question from Anarchy ASF who asks, how does it feel being so young overall in the scene as a designer? Even if you might think so, how did you slash do you deal with being so young and feeling like you have to be successful all the time? That's a great question in the sense that esports can be discouraging sometimes because you feel like, I think it's like a wild, wild west. It's a young growing industry, but we're also asked to be pretty big professionals. As someone who runs the show at one of the best organizations in America and someone as creative as yourself, is there an extra layer of one, you should be incredibly proud for that, Rose, but two, like, what's that kind of essence like?
Oh my God, this is such a big question that I cannot wait to answer. I genuinely think that I have ignored it for the most part. I've always considered myself more of a back behind the scenes kind of person.
For sure.
I really enjoy making things. I don't necessarily care if people see it in like the masses or not, right?
Yeah.
I've kind of accidentally landed myself in this position of like being a content creator where I used to make like, oh, like Genshin stuff for fun, or like I used to
Yeah.
do TikTok for fun. And that just kind of like grew into its own beast by complete accident because I really like making things. It doesn't matter to me if people see them or not. It just matters that I made it and it makes me happy. So that kind of weird buildup and then mixing that in with working in esports, it was so weird because I felt the pressure. I felt like I had to be good all the time. And I'm just naturally a perfectionist, not in the fun, I'm super good at everything I do kind of way, but
Yeah.
like the I will sit there and meticulously pick at something for hours until my head hurts, and I will do that for hours on end even though it's very unhealthy, and I will have very bad work life separation because of it.
Mm.
I've given myself more lenience now, but when I first started out, it was very difficult to come to terms with, I don't necessarily think of myself as I don't wanna say I don't necessarily think of myself as successful because I feel like I've done really well for myself, but I will say that sometimes people will bring up the accomplishments that I've had, and I'll always be like, "Oh, yeah, I did that. I kinda forgot about that."
Yeah.
So, it's it's something that I'm still kind of at grips with. I'm very confident in myself, I understand the position that I'm in. I'm understanding that I'm very lucky to be at the position that I'm in. That's just something that I have accepted, but I don't think I would go around being like, "Oh, like, I'm the best." Do you
Yeah.
know?
No,
I
modesty is
would
key. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very difficult to kind of match up to where I think I stand in terms of success because I'll always constantly feel like, oh, maybe I'm falling behind creatively. Maybe
Mhm.
I'm not working hard enough as what I'd like to. Maybe my output isn't where I want it to be. And it's kind of as if I'd be much more harder on myself because I didn't feel like my output was there. But it helped me a lot to remind myself that in spite of the general harshness of myself and how hard I am, it's something that I want to say that creative processes take time. Making good work takes time. And because I feel inadequate in that one moment where I feel like I've really like fallen off,
Mhm.
it doesn't necessarily mean that I actually have. I think it's just moments where I would feel very pressured in some ways and I would have to conform to some things that I didn't necessarily want to, but it's it's something very weird that I haven't fully grasped onto yet, I think. I don't think I'm very much used to having this many people look at me and having this many people perceive me. I still think of myself as like, you know, I don't think of myself as like a public facing as much as I actually am. And I'm coming to terms with that in the recent months where it's like, oh yeah, I am extremely public facing, but it's in this way where I don't think I intend on, becoming necessarily some kind of like educator or like a I don't want to say leader, but I do
Yeah,
want to say
like
that
a role model or
yeah, like I
yeah.
don't want to necessarily put myself out there as a role model because I feel like because I'm so young, despite the success that I've had, it's it doesn't feel right to say. Do you know what I mean?
No,
It's
I
I
get it, yeah.
understand that I have done a really good job in doing what I want to do, but I wouldn't call myself like some kind of like legend in esports usually. I
Yeah.
think it's really nice people think of me that way though. I just haven't felt like I've personally done enough to prove to myself that I've done that.
For sure. Yeah, and I think ultimately, like I've always been someone who is just keep thriving at your own game. You know what I mean? Do what you want to do that makes you happy and what you continue to excel at and focus on yourself. And you'll meet people that one, it's cool when they jump on board that look seek mentorship, but two, it's just, and it should all be in the names of just building relationships and growing together. But it seems like you definitely have a good mindset in mind, and I'm excited to see you continue to grow as well. Being lucky enough to call myself one of your coworkers. But again, at this time, I'd love to thank everyone for attending and watching this night's show. Rose, thank you so much for joining. I had a great time connecting and chatting. It was really fun, and we can hope to see you again sometime.
Yeah.
At this time, I'd also love to remind everyone about next week because next week we will be celebrating TSMU's first birthday. This will be a special anniversary Q&A next Wednesday, April 6th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time with a very, very special guest. I call her the queen of TSM. Sometimes I call her Khaleesi, but her name is Ali Ahehi, and she's a marketing programs manager and creator of TSMU. She is amazing, a really just good friend and great person, and amazing mentor to look up to. So please tune in next week. It's going to be a banger of an episode. Be sure to follow the channel so you know when we're live. And please join TSMU at discord.gg/TSMU. TSMU. Again, thank you guys so much for joining. It's awesome. It was awesome seeing you. I'll see you next time.
Sure. Thank you guys.